So good afternoon everybody. My name's Georgia Peskett and this is my studio. As you can see, I've got quite a bit of my work around me. So this is where I spend a lot of my time, and I would like to introduce myself to you and let you know a little bit about me. So I was born in London in the 1960s. Both my parents are artists, they still are. And at the time, when I was very young, my father was at the Royal College of Art and my mother, they met when she was at Kingston Art College. So she was doing ceramics and he was doing fine art at the Royal College. So I would say that growing up in the house I was in, it was very interesting, very colourful, very inspiring. And I think it had quite a lot of bearing on my becoming an artist. I think it was a big inspiration for me because I grew up seeing a lot of paintings. There was a lot of music in my house. My father was also, and still is, a musician. So we'd have the piano playing, there'd be a lot of visual art going on. So there was a lot of inspiration really from an early age. So I think I grew up being inspired and wanting to be an artist, and I think from quite an early age I thought that's what I want to do. I want to create, I want to make things that are interesting. So as a child I was constantly drawing and painting and discovering medium and things like that. So throughout school I knew that that was what I was going to do, and I applied to go to Epsom Art School. So I went there in the 80s and we had some very good tutors there, and I think they nurtured, when they saw any talent or ability, they gave us a good education, a good sort of grounded knowledge in, it was general art and design that I studied, which sort of gives you the foundations that you need when you then go on to specialise. Now from there, I was all set to specialise in something. I thought, well, what am I going to do? I loved painting, I liked drawing, so I thought, well, shall I be an illustrator? So I looked into some courses and I thought, yeah, I'll go to I'll go on to do some illustration work, and I thought that might be good because I could make some money and do creative work at the same time. So I began a course at Richmond Polytechnic in Surrey, and I spent about a year doing graphic design for advertising and publicity. However, I thought there was going to be more illustration on this course, so obviously when I got going with that, I thought, no, that's not for me. I didn't want to do packaging, I didn't want to work on food packaging, that kind of thing, labelling. I found that quite boring. So at that time, in the 80s, my father happened to be in New York and he had a loft and he was painting out there. So he suggested I go out there and maybe spend some time and learn about painting and living in a studio and maybe, doing a kind of an apprenticeship really, which is what it turned out to be. So I guess I was about, probably about 15 when I first went over there. The second time when I decided I didn't want to do illustration after all, I went over at 18. And I spent quite a bit of time over there. I was there for probably about 3 years on and off, working with different artists, other artists in their lofts and their studios. And I was sort of an apprentice slash assistant, and it was an incredibly informative time for me. I really learned so much. I learned all the basics that I know now. Back then, things that I didn't learn about when I was doing my course at Epsom Art School. I just learned on the job really, from artists who were exhibiting and showing out there in New York at the time. People like Joe LaPlaca. I was his assistant for about Well, it was a few months, and he then went on to become director of ArtNet here in the UK. And there were many others that I worked with, just doing things like, you know, just preparing canvases, mixing colours, fetching water, the real basics of the job. So I was like stretching up canvases for people. So even learning that for me was really useful. And then working with my father on projects that, you know, where I've just learned so much about paint as the medium, you know, and I learned to paint with acrylics, then oils. And one of the things that started to happen when I was out there is that I started to look around me at the environment that I was in. So we were in the Lower East Side, Manhattan, it was like the early 1980s, and it was an extremely exciting time to be there. There wasn't the gentrification that there is now in New York. So I was this young girl really looking for inspiration, and I would even just look out, we'd be staying with friends usually, or we were kind of sofa surfers a lot of the time. And I would look out of the window and I would be absolutely blown away by the detail, the perspectives, the buildings. It was quite an amazing place to be, really. And so I'm going to show you one of my first drawings. Now I see this drawing as a springboard. This was one of my first pieces that I worked on when I was over there, and it was I only had a sketchbook and some pencils. But this is how I saw the world when I think I was about 19 at this time. And I was just looking out of a window, looking out, and it was near the Bowery, 2nd Avenue, and these characters were just coming out of my imagination. It was really hot. We were sitting inside, you know, and it was maybe waiting to go out later. And I was just looking around and seeing all of this stuff that was happening, you know. So my idea, my aesthetics was starting to develop at that age. So really this led me on to want to work on other things. So when I got the chance, I would stretch up a big canvas, and I would start, and did a really big version of this, and it was about 6 feet long, because we were lucky enough to have a studio out on the Hamptons, and it was at Hampton Bays, and it was quite run down. It was next to the railway tracks, but it was a really good fun, and I look back on that time in my life as incredibly informative. It was when I suppose it was when I developed my style, and then I kind of, you know, it grew and grew from that, really. So I spent quite a bit of time learning out there, so I see that as an apprenticeship. There were other things and people who have inspired me over the years as well. So when I was back in London, I was working away I didn't have a big studio space, but I was up in North London for about 7 years. And I was again looking at the cityscape, and I wanted to paint the city again. And I was looking around at other artists who were exhibiting at that time. So about 20 years ago, I visited I can't remember the gallery, I wish I could, it was Cork Street. And I just dropped in, and I'd been drawn by what I saw was Jock McFadden's solo show. And this painter has also been a really big inspiration to me. So I really love this guy's work. So I bought this book. I went in and I looked at his work, and I was just so inspired by his style of working. The fact that it's just everyday, you know, it's the everyday stuff. I'll just unfold that cover for you. So this is also one of my favourite paintings of his. And then inside there's a whole, it sort of documents his life as a painter, but you know, some of his early work was completely different to the work that he does now. So there's a sort of a development that you can see happening in this book, but some of these just simple studies of buildings, the London Underground. I think this had quite a big effect on me, because I was thinking my work was already kind of going in that direction. It was already along those lines, and I was sort of thinking, yeah, I'd like to work, you know, work in that kind of style, but not to copy that artist, but that I would say that he was an inspiration to me. There's just so many things, even just the colours and the textures I love. You know, that just the fact that he builds up the texture so much in his work. So this guy was a big inspiration. I'd say Jock McFadden was an artist that I really, really liked the work of. So another artist that I also discovered a little later, maybe about 8 years later. I didn't know the work of Peter Doig. I knew his work and I'd heard of him, but I hadn't seen his work in the flesh. So in 2008, I went with my mother to I think it was Tate Britain, and he had a massive solo show there. It was like a retrospective, really. And the scale of the work was absolutely incredible. It was so inspiring. And just his colours, I'll just pick out a couple for you, but some of his paintings have, like these beautiful pieces, just this night scene over here on this side. I mean, that's enormous, you know, it's meters long, and I think that this had a really big effect on my work, because I had been doing cityscapes for quite a while, but then I saw this and I just sort of thought, well, look what you can do with paint. Look, you know, look how you can make paint work. And some of his work is just, this, you know, it really has inspired me. And I can sort of see glimpses of Bonnard in his work as well. So it's kind of, you can see how one artist influences another artist, and so it goes on. But you can sort of see all these beautiful colours and marks in there. He's a very, very talented painter, another big influence on my work. So going back to and here's another great, I couldn't help but throw Hopper in. Now Hopper's been sort of with me as an influencer and an inspiration probably since I first discovered his work when I was a teenager. And I just love his isolated, lonely paintings. They just take you to this sort of quiet place somewhere. But I think right now, his work is being looked at again with fresh eyes. I think we're all looking at Hopper in a new light now, because of where we are right now and what's happening with the you know, with the isolation that we're all experiencing right now in this particular moment in time. I mean, this one in particular sums that up beautifully. So there are a few of the artists there that have been with me and inspired me along the way. Going back to some of my shows and exhibitions, I'd like to just say a little bit about those as well. So this is one of my first solo exhibitions that I had this was 2007. So this was quite an important exhibition for me. It was paintings of New York and London. So these are some of my urban realism paintings. And again, I do like the solitary figure. So you can see how my work has had the influence of Hopper in there and other artists. You know, these inspirations have all crept in somehow. So those are some other ones, some of my earlier works. Yeah, so these are from 2007. And from that period of work, I was really fortunate enough I went over to New York to gather these reference images, and I was over there for maybe you know, a couple of weeks, just photographing the city. And some of these images have been used, because I have my work in the Bridgman Art Library. Some of these have fortunately been used for book jackets, which is really great. So in fact, those two that I just showed you from the catalogue have been used for you know, for publication, which is really nice, because it means that they're out there and, you know, they're being seen, but not quite in the same way as an illustration would be. So moving on now, I'd like to show you a little of my technique and how I actually make them. So I'm going to just show you, these are the basics. This is what I use in the making of my work. So I've got a board. So this is MDF. I cover it with canvas and I prime it. So I prime that not just once, but maybe about 4 or 5 times, sanding it in between. So I get this lovely gessoed surface, really, really smooth. And then I don't just leave it at that. I used to just paint on that, and that was fine. That was like, this is part of my process that I go through. It's quite a lengthy preparation. Then I have a piece of silk. So then that gets stretched over the canvas. like so. So then I'd have a staple gun and staple that on like that. So then I'm stapling that on there, and then it's all stretched nice and tight, and then that gets primed with, I use a clear gesso primer, like a clear PVA, which secures it and adheres it to the canvas underneath. And then I have a super smooth, lovely surface to work upon, which looks something like this. So then that's all ready to paint on. So if I show you one of my paintings, you can see back and front. I'm going to just show you the back there. So there you can see the silk, and you can also see the canvas underneath. And then it's all secured onto this lovely board, but then it just gives you such a lovely surface. I'm just bringing it in really close so you can see how nice that surface is, you know, once it's actually painted on. And the detail that I can get with that is, I just couldn't get that kind of detail when I was working before. When I just worked straight on canvas, it was okay, but I just prefer the effect that I get with that. And I'm a big fan of these. They're Michael Harding oils. They're beautiful. They're handmade. They're hand ground pigment paint. So they've got this really lovely, rich colour to them. You know, I think once you start using Michael Harding colours, it's quite hard to go back to. Some of the other ones are really good, so I'm certainly not being paid to say this, but you know, there's so many great oil paints out there, and if you know, these are something that if you want some of the higher series numbers, it's well worth investing in some, because you know, some of the cadmium colours are amazing. Some of the blues are really great. So just to show you a few more of my pieces before I finish here. This is another fairly recent one. This one was from late last year. This is called Leicester Crow. I don't know if you can see it a bit better if I just turn it around. You can just sort of see, I sometimes put a little bit of glaze to just bring out some of the blacks and make them a little bit richer. But this is what I'm talking about with these cadmium reds and yellows. These are all from the Michael Harding range. And I just think they're great paints to work with. And they suit my purpose. I just really like the depth that I get with them. So just to recap, if you'd like to see any of my work, I have work on my website, which is georgiapeskett.com, so you can take a look there at some of my work. I've also got an Instagram page where I update my work regularly. I'll be putting links in underneath to all of these places where you can see me at the end. And if anybody's got any comments they want to, or any questions they want to ask me, then please feel free, and I can answer you at the end of this. So yeah, so I think that's kind of covered most of the things about my work that I wanted to. Yes, and I've really enjoyed sharing all of this with you. So thank you for joining me in my studio, and it's been a pleasure.